Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on ISO 45001 Fundamentals and Requirements for Auditing and Legal Compliance. I'm your host, Jessica. I'm the Marketing Manager at Mnemonic. ISO 45001 replaced OHSAS 18001 last year and is the first truly international occupational health and safety standard. While a few companies have adopted the standard already, many safety professionals are still unsure about its requirements and benefits. To provide you with an overview of the standard and share implementation best practices, we have invited leading safety and ISO 45001 experts, Greg Zigulis and Ferri. Greg has over 33 years of environmental health and safety experience within several different industries. He's a certified OHSAS 18001, ISO 45001, and ISO 14001 auditor. He's an active member of the ANSI-ASSP Z10 Committee on Occupational Health and Safety Management Systems. He's also a certified safety professional, a certified industrial hygienist, has a bachelor's degree in engineering and an MBA in general management. He's worked for several types of organizations in safety, health, and environmental capacity, including Air Force, construction, Department of Energy, Tier 1 auto parts, manufacturing, etc. You can learn more about him on his website, sixthsense-safety-solutions.com. Ferri is the Vice President of the National Construction Practice at Hayes Companies, headquartered in Minneapolis, Minnesota. She holds a master's degree in environmental health and safety, is an OSHA outreach trainer for construction, and certified safety professional. Abby is responsible for risk control, program development, training, and regulatory compliance for her clients in the construction, manufacturing, energy, beverage, hospitality, and retail industries throughout the United States and Canada. In addition to providing services for clients, Abby is an adjunct instructor in the construction management program at Dunwoody College of Technology, president-elect of the Northwest chapter of the American Society of Safety Professionals, and administrator of the Women in Safety Excellence Common Interest Group of the ASSP. You can learn more about Abby and the Hayes Companies National Construction Practice at hayescompanies.com. And for those of you who are attending Mnemonic's webinar for the first time, I would quickly introduce Mnemonic as well before we get started with the webinar. Mnemonic exists to improve the environment, worker safety, and product quality through easy-to-manage compliance. Organizations around the world from all industries rely on Mnemonic to comply to environmental, health and safety, and quality regulations and standards. Mnemonic offers an up-to-date database of environmental health and safety and quality regulatory requirements for global jurisdictions, and easy-to-use web and mobile software to audit and manage those requirements, as well as air quality monitoring devices. The integration of a regulatory content with software and monitoring devices helps the client stay ahead of the compliance curve. You can learn more about Mnemonic at mnemonic.com. That's all for the introductions. I'm happy to say we have 200 attendees already, and there are more joining in. Thank you all so much for participating in this webinar. Please note that you can send your questions using the chat box in the GoToWebinar panel at any time. We will address your questions at the end of the presentation. Over to you, Abby.
Thank you so much for the introductions, and thanks so much everybody for being on this session today. A quick overview of our goals. We will go through some details of the ISO 45001 standard and talk about how it's different and similar to other standards that are already out there. We'll also give you some requirements that you might want to look at for your business, and some also legal requirements and requirements for compliance and auditing. And we'll get into the bulk of the presentation will be about practical implementation considerations. So please do, as we go through this, add your questions to the function within the webinar panel, and we will get to those at the end of the session. So first, we want to find out a little bit more about you that are attending this session. So we'd like to launch our first poll question and find out a little bit more about those attending.
Sure, Abby. Okay. So the poll question is, my biggest reasons for participating in today's webinar are to learn more about ISO 45001 fundamentals, compliance or auditing implications in the standard, any missing information about achieving certification, and implementation ideas. So we have people still voting in. Okay, so Abby, I'll just share the results with you. We still have people Okay, so 75% have voted, so I'll just share. So almost 65% of people, the reason they're joining is ISO 45000 to learn more about ISO 45001 fundamentals, 60% to learn about compliance and auditing implications in the standard, almost 50% for implementation ideas, and 20% for any missing information.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I'm just realizing that didn't add up to 100%.
No, it's actually no.
Yeah,
so they could choose more than one
goal.
Yes.
That's awesome. So attendees have multiple goals. We have multiple goals for this session. So this works perfectly. So a quick introduction to the ISO standard. It's available for purchase, as with any ISO standards, and I highly recommend it. I don't make anything off of this. I just recommend that safety professionals and risk management professionals have this standard in their toolbox. So you can find it in the ANSI web store, the ISO store, and if you're an ASSP member, there's a discounted price for ASSP members. So I strongly encourage that as well. So why do we need this standard now? It's a proactive and global approach to safety and risk management, and it came about in the case for the standard is because over 7,600 people die each day at work, and this is over 2.7 million people that each year suffer from workplace injuries or disease. So the human cost is a huge reason for why this risk management standard was put together. And the biggest piece is probably this organizational responsibility for promoting and protecting the physical and mental health of workers. And in the US, we're starting to talk more about total worker health and mental health and how that impacts the worker on the job. So this ISO 45001 standard gives employers a way to establish and get some ideas on how to implement and direct and maintain their occupational health and safety management system related to not just the physical health of the workers, but also mental health as part of that total worker health piece. But your mileage may vary. So depending on the context of your business, you may have a lot of employees spread out over multiple locations, or you might be a smaller regional contractor like a lot of my customers are. And as I've learned more and dug more into ISO 45001, I see that it's got something for everybody. So even though it's an international standard and it's an ISO standard, it doesn't mean that it's just for large, complex organizations. So looking at the different things to implement with the standard, you look at your current occupational health and safety management system, the types of activities that your workers are conducting, and the nature of those risks. There's a lot that safety professionals and risk management professionals are saying about ISO 45001, and one of the people that's been instrumental with this throughout the world is Kathy Seabrook, and her quote is there on the screen. And her emphasis for the implementation and use of ISO 45001 is really that supply chain angle, that it's not just your immediate business, but how this can impact safety and risk management with other organizations that are in your supply chain. Vic Toy from the Technical Advisory Group, he's the chairperson of that group, and he's echoing a sentiment that you'll see later on about how ISO 45001 is one of the most significant developments in workplace safety over the years. So it's not like a fly-by-night type of standard, it's not a flavor of the month type of thing, but it was really designed to have a lasting impact, and that's worldwide. And Tom Sesich, who was president of ASSE at the time, now it's called ASSP, he's saying that ISO 45001 is probably going to be one of the largest and most significant safety standard impacts of the past, or in the last 50 years. So what the standard does is it focuses on systems versus programs. And so it's how safety professionals have changed our verbiage and how we use words with our people in the field. I know when I first started in safety, we would say accident, and now the accepted term or the way that we look at it, it's an incident, just to change the language to further make sure workers understand words have meaning, and an accident kind of makes a person want to just throw their hands up in the air, whereas using the word incident is something to be studied and analyzed. So again, seeing this shift of terminology, and instead of using the word safety programs, that we're starting to talk more about systems, because it's something that we can apply that plan, do, check, act philosophy to, versus a program that's geared towards compliance. So looking at things like risks and opportunities versus how am I going to comply with a standard and put specific things in place, but more of having an organization take a look at what are their risks and how can we approach these risks. The other thing I like about the ISO 45001 standard is that it reiterates multiple times that safety is top management's responsibility, and very frequently throughout the standard, it brings this point up. So if you're looking at the ISO 45001 standard and thinking about how it can fit into your company culture, think about who those top management people are. And that's your group that you need to talk to and get on board first before you can get this thing going at your organization. So the ISO 45001 standard is great for assessment. So taking a look at your existing safety management systems, it's a great way to do some self-assessment of how things are going and what you can improve. But on the flip side, personally, I work with a lot of clients that they're starting from scratch. So I often look at it that it's almost easier to start from scratch when you have such a great tool like this standard. However, it is still a great tool for self-assessment as well. And again, that top management emphasis and looking at management failures as they apply to occupational health and safety for the workers. Greg will do a much deeper dive into the clauses, but this is a quick overview of the real heart of the standard, which is these clauses 4 through 10, where we're talking about the context of your organization and different ways to analyze and understand where you're starting from. Looking at leadership and worker participation next, if you look at this circle as a clock face, we're going clockwise. So there's ways to assess leadership and worker participation within the standard. Then the standard guides you into planning, support, operation, and how you conduct performance and evaluation, and then improvement. How do we continue that cycle of plan, do, check, act on the way towards continuous improvement? And again, Greg is going to get way deeper into those clauses later on. So looking at a gap analysis and how you would look at your program, there's a lot of resources that go right hand in hand with ISO 45001. And the first thing that I thought of is the OHSA Voluntary Protection Program. So there's a great resource that this link will be available for people attending the session, is this crosswalk related to voluntary standards that are under OHSA's umbrella and also with other organizations. So we've got OHSA's recommended practices guidelines that were published in 2016 that talk about hazard identification and assessment. So if you don't have a tool to address how are we looking at hazard identification, OHSA has a tool for you. OHSA guidelines dating back to 1989 also talk about worksite analysis and how we can get employee feedback and looking at different facilities and processes that you have in place. And then we get into more modern times, and we've got the VPP STAR program from 2000, where the OHSA Voluntary Protection Program status that you can achieve at the federal or state plan level in the US, these provide a great complement to ISO 45001. Of course, Greg will talk more about the ANSI Z10 standard as well as ISO 45001. And right in between there at the bottom, the National Safety Council has a tool that you can use to talk about risk. And that's their Journey to Safety Excellence program from 2013. So these are all great tools that if you access this link, you'll be able to access each of these individual links for these different voluntary protection programs, or excuse me, just voluntary compliance programs. And at this point, I'd like to find out just a little bit more about the group and launch our second poll question.
Sure. So the question is, my knowledge of the ISO 45001 standard is excellent, I know it inside out, good, I have not worked through all the issues, fair, mostly based on other ISO and health and safety management system standards, and I do not know much and still gathering information. Okay, so we have 75% people voted already. So just 1% of the people say they have excellent information. 46%, the majority of the people they say they have their knowledge is fair, mostly based on other ISO and health and safety management system standards. 25% say they have good information, and 30% still don't know much and still gathering information.
Awesome, thank you. So that information is very helpful to understand about the attendees, because Greg is going to talk further about ISO 45001 and of course implementation as well. And I think, Greg, I think this is the point that you take over.
It is. Thank you, Abby.
Thank you.
Great background on various reasons for why the standard exists and different management systems. And so hello, everyone. I'm Greg Zigulis. And now that Abby has covered some of that other information, and she's given me a lot to talk about here, I'll continue with talking about some of the selection factors between these different standards before moving on into talking about some of the specific clauses and how they might pertain to audit requirements and compliance requirements. And then at the end, some implementation considerations. So to begin with, like Abby was saying, there are lots of different management system models out there, and one size does definitely not fit all. But ISO 45001 may be very appropriate, very helpful, and a great model for your organization, just depending. And you know, it was specifically developed to apply across a number of different organizations. Some people think of it only in terms of manufacturing or organizations of a certain level of sophistication and size. And while those types of organizations can apply the standard, there are others as well. And even the other day, I was talking with some folks about some retail type applications. And so consider it. It is a great model. And some of the benefits of implementing the system include that this is really meant to be flexible and to provide for integration of health and safety into other processes of the business. You know, this is really not just a safety-centric type standard written by safety, only for safety. A big feature of this is integration and alignment. But there are other standards out there as well, like Abby was mentioning. And ultimately, the selection for you may depend upon the size of your organization, where you are in the supply chain, whether or not you already have existing management systems, the part of the world that you're in. But a common theme or common themes from 45001 or the Z10 standards, for example, include application of a systems type approach, an approach where you're looking for conformance against management system requirements, but also compliance to legal and other requirements, as well as there is typically a function for, or there are functions for and requirements for auditing against conformance, compliance, and other things. So another big feature, I don't have it on the slide here, is, if you could just go back one, please. Another big feature is that this is designed to avoid sub-optimization, because you're considering the interrelationship between different business processes. And you don't want to have a situation where something you do for one part of the business is going to adversely impact your health and safety outcomes and performance. So an example that I've heard a number of times for this is the case of someone manufacturing an automobile. And if you can have parts of your engineering design team work on, optimizing an engine, optimizing a drivetrain, optimizing steering systems, what have you. And if you optimize each of those individual components, the problem is that when you pull them all together and try to make your car run, your car might not run optimally, so you've sub-optimized. And so this standard is, again, all about interrelationships. But now let me shift to talking about a couple of specific comparisons. If you could shift to the next slide, please. Thank you. So let me start by talking about OHSAS 18001. So that was a British standard applied in many different locations, but it was not truly an international standard from the standpoint that it was not a ISO document. The British Standards Institute has determined that it is going to let the 18001 be phased out and replaced by 45001 over a 3-year period from the time that it was first published. So practically speaking, that means that by March of 2021, if you had an 18001 certification, you will need to have transitioned to the 45001. Now, if you have the 18001 certification, that certainly can be of great value in your transition. But then again, there are some definite differences. So for example, the ISO 45001 standard uses a different organization, whereas the requirements from 18001 were bundled into clause 4. Within the ISO 45001 standard, they take those requirements, they basically spread them out between clauses 4 through 10, and then they add other things in there besides. Another key difference, though, besides the physical structure of the document, the organization, is that it talks a lot about context of the organization, which I'll talk about more in a couple of minutes, and risks and opportunities. So they've added the requirement to look at opportunities and not just risk. So those are some differences that are kind of unique to the fact that it's an ISO management system standard, but there are also some differences that are unique to the fact that it's a safety standard within the ISO system of management system standards. So a couple of key points here include there's some significant difference here on what's expected of top management. There are some significant differences in terms of what is expected for worker participation. There's a lot more emphasis on health and not just more purely physical type considerations. And there's an expanded definition of what's included as being part of the workplace. And there's an expanded definition for who is considered to be a worker. Okay, thank you. So what I'm hearing from a number of organizations who have the 18001 and they're working towards transitioning, what I hear them struggling with include that senior management does not always understand truly some of the fundamental shift in thinking in terms of their roles and responsibilities and how they're expected to be actively participating and supporting the safety culture and eliminating roadblocks and ensuring integration. They also struggle with providing meaningful worker participation, right? It's no longer the case that participation means, well, we give people an opportunity to participate in a safety committee. It means real, true participation in the activities required by the standard. And then another thing people struggle with sometimes is that their culture is just not there yet. They could support rolling out in 18,001 and they got by with what they had, but sometimes their culture is not ready for some of the fundamental shifts. All right, so now I'll compare or share some information about the Z10 standard here in comparison to 45,001. So you may or may not know that there's a new ANSI ASSP Z10 standard. It's expected to be published in approximately the July of 2019 timeframe for those who would be working with the US-based standard. It's going to be an excellent document. There's lots of good information. There are a lot of similarities to the ISO 45001, and part of that is because a lot of the people on the Z10 committee actually are also members on the 45001 committee. And so you'll see similarities, although the reasons for implementation might be different. They were developed differently. The ISO standard has 45001 standard, of course, had to be developed for the world, really. And so there are very kind of nuanced issues pertaining to language and the fact that some of what they were going to say in the 45001 standard would in fact become a law in some countries, whereas of course for probably everyone on this call, it's just considered to be a consensus standard. But it can be a very helpful resource, so you might consider taking a look at that for some really good information when that is published. One other point I'd like to make here, and I think this is important, especially considering the poll results we got, is that it can be easy for organizations to mistake or mistakenly think that just because you have 18,001 in place, or maybe you've got an ISO 14001 program, which of course the ISO 14001 program is also a ISO management system standard using this Annex SL structure. It's just, there are definite differences, and don't necessarily think it will be a transition that will not take planning and effort. Next slide, please. So now I'll move into giving you a bit of an overview of clauses 4 through 10, but with a particular emphasis on compliance and auditing requirements. So it sounded like a fair number of people could use some additional information just on the basic content of these clauses. And of course, we have a very limited period of time. I'll try to hit some highlights here that I think would be most helpful to you. So starting, the requirements of the standard start really with clause 4. Clause 4 is basically saying, hey, organizations need to understand when the context, what they refer to in the standard as the context of the organization or business context. And what they really mean there is that organizations have to identify and consider or take into account in some cases both external and internal issues which could affect the intended outcome of the standard that you're rolling out. Now, when I say intended outcome, it's just a term that's in the standard in several different places. In it, the intended outcome is going to be minimizing the potential for adverse events and injuries and continual improvement and compliance, typically speaking. All right, so clause 4.1 talks about external issues. What could those be? Well, that can include things like financial considerations, technological considerations, market competition, suppliers, new technology, but also it includes relevant legislation. Now, how about internal issues? What might they be talking about there? Well, that can include things like governance, organizational structure, culture, contractual relationships, and things like that. All right. But also then there's clause 4.2, which talks about interested parties, because organizations are also expected to identify the so-called needs and expectations of interested parties. And interested parties can include regulators. So of course there's a tie-in there to needing to understand legal requirements. Okay. And then organizations have to take that information and put it together when determining the scope of their management system. Okay, next slide, please. So, actually, can you go back one slide, please, Abby? All right, so you see on this slide a picture of sort of an org chart in the background, and I wanted to point out that organization charts are not actually explicitly required in the 45,001 standard. However, there is a requirement to clearly identify roles and responsibilities, and so many organizations still might choose to have organization charts, but you can do that different ways. Okay, next slide, please. All right, clause 5 talks about leadership and worker participation. So this is a significant change in terms of what is practically speaking required, because top management here is being asked to specifically align the safety management system with the business objectives. It's specifically being told, if you want to get certified to the standard, then you have to integrate health and safety into the other business processes. You have to, as reflected in clause 5.1, provide resources. You have to specifically think about, address, promote, encourage an occupational health and safety culture. And then I'll skip 5.3, we've already discussed that, but clause 5.4 talks about worker consultation and participation. And that's one that gets a lot of people, right? Because they really and truly mean here active participation of workers in meaningful ways. So it could include participating in risk analyses, coming up with solutions to problems, being on special teams, and things like that. Okay, next slide, please. So, how is top management going to be particularly effective with providing for that integration and providing for that support if it doesn't understand its requirements, right? How is it going to provide and plan for the resources that it needs if it doesn't understand those requirements? So, speaking of planning, here we are at clause 6. Clause 6, and there are different clauses that go into, or they're like sub-clauses under clause 6. Many more requirements than are reflected in the slide here. But basically, this is saying, hey, if you've considered those internal and external issues, if you considered and taken into account the needs and expectations of interested parties, you've got to take that information and roll that into your planning processes. And oh, by the way, you also, under clause 6, have requirements for hazard identification and the determination of risks and opportunities, as well as to maintain documented information on those risks and opportunities. And specifically, though, I want to call out clause 6.13 here, which requires specifically the determination of legal requirements and other requirements. Okay, so how do you do that? Well, yes, organizations can do that on their own, and maybe many of you have already done that. Many organizations have something in place, but I want to say that it is particularly pointed out and emphasized in the 45,001 standard. Now, I know that as a plant person, when I was working in a plant role, which I did and for much of my career, I've needed to sometimes do that research on my own. And then again, there were times when my organization had a service that assisted with the identification of those requirements. And so I think that which method you choose and which way you go, how you do that, is going to depend upon the complexity of the potential issues that your organization can face, and how many different locations you operate in, and generally speaking, what are your inherent in-house resources. Okay, next slide, please. So the actual requirements for taking that information and planning and setting objectives is contained in clause 614, planning action. So basically what this is saying is organizations taking into account all that information we've been talking about have to identify in plans the who, what, when, where, why of what they're going to do, for one thing. I also want to point out that, though, that there is a very specific sentence in this section that requires organizations to define how organizations or plan for how actions will be integrated into business processes. So very specific discussion on integration in there. Okay, so planning action needs to include plans to address risks and opportunities and plans to address legal and other. Okay, again, how are you going to know what those legal and other are? Of course, unless you have a specific and good process to do that. Okay, next slide, please. All right, support requirements are contained in clause 7. Although this slide starts off referencing clause 7.5, I would like to point out to you here that the support requirements in clause 7 basically say organizations are expected to provide the resources necessary to implement, maintain, and ensure the effectiveness of this management system. Resources of all types, whether you're talking about resources for development of procedures or industrial hygiene monitoring or auditing or the identification of legal and other requirements. It's defined in clause 7. Clause 7 also talks about the need to ensure the competence of people who are taking on roles in rolling out this program, where what they do is critical to the effectiveness and success of the management system. So how do you ensure the competence of those who are involved in the administration of the system? There are some definite requirements and things that you should look at in the standard that talk about competence and the need to determine basically what would constitute competence for people functioning in different roles. It also talks about awareness and communication before then rolling down into clause 7.5 pertaining to documented information. And the reason I have this one highlighted is that it talks about, needing to keep the information necessary for ensuring the effectiveness of the management system, and also documented information includes relevant legal and other requirements, as well as going beyond that, audit results and information. And actually, section 9 of the standard talks about the need to keep records from your internal auditing, your internal audit results. Okay, next slide, please. Clause 8 takes us to operations. So this is meant to talk about the processes needed to meet the requirements of the system, and it also talks about implementing actions from clause 6. So remember, in clause 6 we had to plan, we had to identify risks and opportunities and so on. Well, clause 8 is talking about how you take that information and then make it happen. So processes that are needed and that they talk about under clause 8 include those needed for the elimination of hazards, those needed for the management of change, which can include regulatory and legal requirement change, as well as processes for determining compliance with your legal and other types of obligations that you might have. It also talks about procurement and outsourcing, because those things obviously can impact the potential outcome of the standard. So the point here in the authors of this document, the writers of this document, including discussion on outsourcing and procurement, is that they didn't want organizations to just be hands-off. They didn't want people to say, oh, I'm going to outsource this process and then I don't have to worry about it. Well, that's not the way it works now under the 45001 standard. To the extent that an organization can control or influence, you're expected to include that in your scope and to include that as part of your system. So this is where some folks would talk about due diligence requirements to ensure a safe, healthful, and compliant workplace. Perhaps in Canada here, we're talking about pre-startup inspections where those requirements would apply, and so on. Next slide, please. Really, perhaps this slide could have been titled Clause 9 because this section is talking about performance evaluation, but there are some big compliance implications here. Now, I want to mention when I talk about compliance here that, of course, we know when we're rolling out this standard, if you're a safety and health professional, that just pure literal compliance to a regulatory obligation is not our big goal. There are so many more things that can go into effectively minimizing our risk. But certainly, compliance is a minimal expectation of rolling out 45001. So it's not the only goal, but it's an element of it. And so Clause 912 talks about the requirement to evaluate compliance because compliance is expected. Okay, so how do you do that? How do you evaluate compliance? Of course, we'll shift in a moment to talk about auditing requirements as one means, but not the only means. Next slide, please. So, best practices for ensuring compliance. Well, I would say that if you just follow the 45001 standard, that provides a framework because compliance expectations are so interwoven into this whole thing. But basically, to sort of connect the dots here, if you understand your obligations, that's going to impact your planning. So therefore, you need to have effective tools for the identification of your obligations and to make sure that you are on top of changes. Now, if you're planning, of course, you have to think about the resources that are needed. You have to set goals and objectives. All right, so you're setting goals and objectives. No business wants to do that for no good reason. So now you have to ask yourself, are you meeting those expectations or not? Well, that's where we talk about evaluation and the need to track and trend your performance, right? Okay, now we're talking about evaluation. How do you evaluate? Well, it can include formal and informal auditing processes, which would include looking at your issues and evaluating the causes for those issues and to provide for continuing review. So there are lots of different things that can be included as part of that process, which I'll talk more about in the auditing section. But if you're auditing, I will say that I think everyone would want robust processes for auditing. And the organization is expected to provide the resources and tools needed to have an effective internal auditing process, right? Looking at your compliance obligations and conformance to the standard. All right, another linkage here is that you need to take that auditing information and feed it into reviews. And reviews can be of several different types, but it would include the obligation to conduct management reviews. And there are specific things that are listed in the standard for what you have to include in your management review for discussion and review, consideration and planning and so on, as well as defined outcomes that you need to be able to document and communicate. And lastly, of course, you need to take certain information, retaining documented information where appropriate. And I want to say here too that the 45,001 standard actually requires less documentation than the 18,001 would. But if you're going to prove to an auditor, to an external auditor, that you're meeting the expectations, then sometimes you're going to maintain documented information just because it's going to help you in your management of the system. Next slide, please. All right, so let me shift to talking about requirements for auditing. Now, the requirement for internal auditing is contained within clause 9.2. But it's not too hard for people to get confused here because there are, lots of different things that potentially could be audited. You've got internal auditing, you've got auditing for conformance and compliance. You might have confusion from thinking about how your audits, internal audits, interact with a certifying body's audits and things like that. So let me take just a second and talk about the fact that there are first, second, and third party audits, and I want to be considerate of everyone's time here. So I'll be brief on this, but an internal audit is thought of as a first party audit. A third party audit is typically going to be your certifying body audit, and second party audits are typically thought of as supplier audits. Okay. So if you want to obtain certification to the 45,001 standard, you are going to need to interact with a certifying body or a registrar. And they're going to have their own processes and procedures defining how they will go about interacting with you and how they conduct their certification process. They can do pre-certification audits, stage 1 and stage 2, where they look at sometimes they look at paperwork, other times they're looking at implementation. Ultimately, they have to look, in order to get certified, they have to look at all the requirements of the standard and ensure you're meeting those requirements. Then there are, once you obtain certification, you can have surveillance audits on top of that. Well, not can have, you will have. If you want to maintain your certification, you will have surveillance audits that occur after the certification but before the time at which your recertification is needed. And typically that's going to be a 3-year cycle. So 3 years after your initial certification, you'll need to make sure you have your recertification. And when they audit you, they're going to evaluate, they're going to evaluate whether or not you have the systems in place to ensure compliance and conformance. Okay, next slide, please. But that said, unless you're in the auditing business and auditing is your full-time profession, probably for most folks on the phone, we're really thinking in terms of internal audits and what you might want to do, be required to do for your internal auditing programs. And I want to point out that there is an ISO standard called ISO 19011, which talks about the auditing of management system standards, and with a special emphasis, well, it's about internal auditing. Now, it's not a mandatory document, but it has a lot of good information, and it talks about audit programs and plans and how you establish scope and criteria and team development. Lots of good information there. Now, I would suggest, if you haven't looked at the 19011 standard, that since it was updated in 2018 to talk about the auditing of integrated management systems, that you might want to take a look. And when I talk about an integrated management system, I'm referring to the fact that when organizations obtain certifications, they could get a certification just for 45,001, or they could have one certification for 14,001, and another certification for 45,001, and one for 9,001, what have you. Or they can have an integrated approach, which provides some efficiency in the management and implementation, as well as the auditing, as well as auditing costs of maintaining certifications to these systems. Okay, next slide, please. So, requirements for auditing, thinking now in terms of internal auditing, your audits. The standard requires that those who are involved in those internal audits be competent. And again, an organization is going to want to determine what they will require for their internal auditors and how they will ensure that competence. And it's certainly going to include training on the requirements of the standard, but it's also going to probably include, or should include, some information about how to work with the registrar, how the registrar's process works, as well as auditing principles and practices and other things. So we could get into a whole lot more discussion here. I would take this section very seriously and be very careful in how you implement your internal auditing program. Next slide, please. So in terms of what you're looking for in your internal auditing, again, we've mentioned compliance and conformance before. Just to clarify terminology, when we're talking about conformance, we're typically talking about whether or not an organization is meeting the requirements of the management system. Compliance is typically referring more to whether or not you're meeting your legal and other regulatory and other requirements. The bottom line is you can't audit to and fulfill the requirements of either one of those unless you are understanding the requirements that you have to audit against. So again, I would ask you, how are you going to do that? Okay, next slide, please. So what are some best practices here? Well, again, internal auditing, the need to know how you're doing and communicate and improve, it's all interwoven in the standard, but you have to think through what you're going to include, what you're not going to include. When are you going to look at what portions of your management system? When are you going to look at what portions of your facilities and operations? How will you communicate? I would use 19011 for guidance if you don't already have a strong corporate program that outlines that. And I want to add that auditors, while they are counted upon, obviously, to use professional judgment, it can also be very, very helpful to have some strong auditing tools, because whatever auditing you implement, you're going to want to make sure that you have some level of consistency in application. You have some level of feeling that if you apply your approach at one location, that you would get similar results at another location. So consistency in approach and scoring and things like that. And some diagnostic tools can sometimes be built into different auditing systems, tracking, trending, reporting. So I would make it easy on yourself by making sure that you carefully consider and choose the best methods for your particular organization. Okay, next slide, please. Clause 10 is talking about improvement, and not much change here. I'll just say that the idea is the organization has to take all this information in, look at its performance, look at its audit results, look at what is happening practically speaking, and learn from what's happening. And I do want to point out here that non-conformities can include failure to apply legal requirements. Okay, next slide, please. And again, so now I'll talk about some implementation considerations. And I realize we're running a little short on time here, so I'll try to wrap this up relatively soon. But when you implement, I think this is key. You have to truly understand the standard. Like Abby was saying, get the standard, understand its requirements. And so, by the way, the 45001 standard used in the US was basically an adaptation directly from the ISO standard. It's my understanding that in Canada, that there was a adoption of the standard, but with Canadian deviations that were felt to better reflect the Canadian context of health and safety. So if you're in Canada, of course, you want to use the Canadian version. There's lots of information on things to consider when rolling out your process. You can do Google searches and find 5-step, 10-step, 12-step processes. At the end of the day, it needs to be something taken very seriously. This is not a one-time rollout. This is a big deal that will just continue, okay? When you analyze, you're going to want to look at both organizational readiness as well as system readiness. So yes, you have to look at, whether or not your organization has the written processes that are needed and the tools that are needed. But I would also strongly look at other readiness factors, which can include, does your company really have the mindset? Is it really where it needs to be from a cultural standpoint? Culture can be a big deal. Now, you don't have to have the perfect culture to roll this out, because this is a continual improvement standard. But you do have to have some level of understanding by the organization and buy-in and commitment to move forward. Okay, next slide, please. We've spoken about the need to understand the context. So probably one of the first things you're going to want to do when you're considering implementation is you got to go through that evaluation of the context. That is something you're going to want to have some kind of record of. Many organizations could choose to use a SWOT analysis or other types of things. I'll also point out regarding the written and not written considerations that you don't have to have, well, the standard identifies what you need to have written and not, but sometimes you might choose to have things written just because it's going to help you manage the system. The other thing is definitely, you can't just take a canned written program that someone's selling off the shelf and say, here we go. Whatever, you can buy canned programs, you can roll them out for your organization, but you're going to have to go through the process of tailoring that information. And then the last thing on this slide is just, you need to have a very well-defined internal auditing program with some strong tools. Those are essentials. Okay, next slide, please. A registrar can help you assess. However, most often that's going to be done by your internal team, with the registrar getting involved after you've already gone through your own internal team analyses. Okay, next slide, please. So after thinking about all that, can 45,001 help improve compliance? I say, yes, absolutely. Compliance is a fundamental expectation of the requirements in the standard. It's interwoven. You know, we're talking about optimizing, not sub-optimizing. You've got to understand your key processes. You've got to integrate health and safety into other portions of the business. It's consistent with other ISO management systems that can help as well because of the intercommunication. Okay, next slide, please. And to get really to the heart of it, talking about compliance, obviously there are specific requirements in the standard to identify those compliance obligations and ensure you're meeting them. And then on top of that, you're going to have both third-party and internal auditors looking at whether you are complying. Next slide, please. So the bottom line is, I believe personally that implementation of the standard provides you with a risk-based approach that is very likely to bring issues to a head for evaluation and provide for best management of your safety management system. Next slide, please. And again, so to wrap it all up, boy, we've covered a lot of information, but we have shared some information. Abby shared information on the background of the standard, the need for it, the benefits of it. We've provided some comparisons, given you some highlights of some of the requirements in the clauses 4 through 10, and try to share with you some compliance and auditing focused information, as well as to share some implementation thoughts. The bottom line is, having ISO 45001 or a similar strong occupational health and safety management system should help improve your safety performance, improve compliance, and decrease your risk. So now we've had a lot of information that we've shared. It's tough within this time frame. You may want further information. If you do, next slide, please. Please feel free to contact Abby or contact me with regard to the 45,001 topics that we've discussed. And thank you for hanging in there. Jessica, are you taking the next slide?
Yes. Thank you. The time's almost over, but I would just take a moment before we take the question and answer session. So as you saw, that the experts mentioned today that legal compliance and auditing are at the core of ISO 45001. The standard requires you to maintain a legal register, also known as compliance obligations, and have a definite system in place to ensure that you're keeping up to date with those requirements as they change on a daily basis. So that's where Mnemonic can help you. We can help you identify your environmental health and safety requirements for your operations. That is, create a legal register for you. We can alert you when those requirements change or when new ones are introduced, and we can provide you with the software to action those requirements, to collaborate with colleagues, and maintain complete records of your compliance efforts. We can also help you save hours and hours on your auditing time, and make your internal audit program much more efficient with our robust mobile auditing app. So once again, we offer both regulatory content and software to action the regulatory content, something that none of the competitors provide. The benefit in using the content and software from the same provider lies in the smooth integration of the two. So it would lead to a very smooth integration without any technical glitches or downtime. That said, we are more than happy to discuss the environmental health and safety legal requirements for your organization. Please send us an email at info@mnemonic.com, or you can call us at 1-888-608-7511. Our clients come from different industries and from all corners of the world. You can find case studies on how we have helped organizations from different industries on our website, mnemonic.com. That said, it's time for question and answers. Please send in. I have a few questions already, but please send in your questions now is the time. Um, for anyone who's asking whether we would be sending the copy of the presentation, no, we will not be sending the copy of this presentation, today's webinar. If you want, you can come to the website mnemonic.com. We'll be posting the recording on our website mnemonic.com under the webinars page. So let me take the first question here. How does safety culture fit in with the rollout of 45001? Does one need a certain level of culture to roll this out? Greg or Abby?
You okay if I take this one, Abby?
Yeah, that's fine. And actually, I have to leave you guys, so you'll have to take the remainder of the questions.
Oh, thank you so much, Abby, for your time.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. If you look at the 45001 standard, there are many different references to safety culture and the need for top management to support a safety culture that would encourage and support implementation of the standard. And it's thought the really safety culture, having a certain level of safety culture, is what is going to help you or your organization to sustain whatever management system it is that you put in place. So it's really an issue of you need some level of culture to help sustain. Culture can be important in so many different ways, though. Obviously, we could get in a long discussion on that. But the expectation is that you will promote it. And I would say that you need to have some level of safety culture moving into implementation of the standard. There has to be some organizational buy-in and support, but it certainly doesn't have to be perfect safety culture. And in fact, there are a number of organizations that implement the 45001 or Z10 standards specifically because they're wanting to put things in place that will help them, in fact, improve their safety culture. Okay.
Thank you, Greg. I'll take another question from Butrint Patali. When you have already an effective integrated management system for quality, environment, and health, which was based on the same clauses provided by ISO 9001 and ISO 14001, what kind of substantial changes you need to implement for the transition from OHSAS 18001 to ISO 45001?
Okay, so obviously in that case, you're already familiar with clauses 4 through 10 as so far as the language is common between standards because of the use of the Annex SL. But there are some very specific additional things that talk specifically about safety, which have a little addition to the standard language from the management system standards requirements. So for example, there's a higher level of expectation there when it comes to worker participation. Or let's take the context of the organization, the external and internal issues. The external and internal issues that may face an organization of a environmental or quality standpoint might be different from those specifically for safety. So really common approach, and I would take advantage of the fact there is that common approach. That's a selling point. But you do need then to add on the extra requirements such as what I just mentioned, and there are a few others in there as well.
Thank you, Greg. I'll take another question from Del Phobes. Are safety committees an expectation in this standard?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Are safety committees an expectation in this standard?
Oh, okay, thank you. Yes, competency is built into the standard. So especially for auditors, but really anyone involved in implementing different portions of the standard, there is an expectation that those persons are competent, and there are different approaches for how to think about competency in terms of looking at training skills, and just the ability to understand and to properly apply requirements. Absolutely it is. And so that's another factor to consider, of course, is that the organization is expected to define what it means to be competent for persons performing different requirements under the standard. And I know that's, you get into a much longer discussion there as well, but yes, absolutely, competence is an expectation.
Thank you, Greg. I'll take another question from Nivedita Mukherjee. Can you show, what are some examples of risks and opportunities?
Okay, so they talk about a couple of different kinds of risks and opportunities here. There are risks and opportunities relative to the success of the management system standard. So a risk could be that, let's say there's some kind of business pressure to implement a new process within a certain time frame based upon competitive pressures, regulation, market share, what have you. And so the fact that your organization wants to implement this and implement it quickly could impact how it views the assurance of the safe management of change. So that could be maybe a risk factor. Anyway, so there's risk pertaining to the system. There's risk pertaining to your hazards in the workplace. I gave you one example that would pertain to changes in the workplace that could pertain to physical safety risks. Opportunities wise, people have a fair amount of confusion on what that means. They're not talking about the kind of typical sense in the workplace where someone sees an issue that needs to be addressed and they say, oh, well, that's a real opportunity for improvement. That's not what they're talking about. They are talking about how when you're working through evaluating your processes, you're evaluating your risk factors, you're looking at your overall system, you may find ways to improve things that could either benefit the business or benefit your overall safety and health performance. So maybe you modify something that is not, maybe through your evaluation you find something you can modify that will result in a higher level of safety, but which fundamentally wasn't really a significant risk, but you want to improve. Okay.
Thank you, Greg. I have another question from Diane Sandbrand. What section of the standard have organizations had the most challenges in meeting the expectations of?
Well, I don't have a comprehensive, good question. I don't have a comprehensive survey across different registrars to give you technically an across the board answer, but from my personal discussions with organizations that are applying the standard, one of them is that sometimes there's an expectation from senior management that someone's going to implement the standard and we're going to give you 2 months to do it. Kind of along the lines of, well, okay, we've got 14,001. Now there's this new 45,001 standard. It's based on the management system standard, or the Annex SL format of ISO. And so golly gee whiz, what could be so tough? We'll give you 2 months to do it. And so there needs to be a lot of extra discussion sometimes between the folks who would practically be providing guidance to the organization about what the requirements are, and truly having a understanding on the part of top management of what shifts in thinking need to occur and what changes would need to occur. The bottom line, though, is I think that it's it's a great question, and it's going to depend upon what type of industry you're in, what your current systems are, what your current levels of risk are, and to best answer the question, you'd have to look at an individual organization and start looking at their context and kind of work from there.
Perfect. Thank you, Greg. There's another question, if you have time to answer that. If you can name 3 documents that should be written down for the transition. So name 3 specific documented information needed during the transition. The question is from Butrint Patali.
Okay. That's a great question. And there are some documents you can find on the web pretty easily that kind of consolidate what mandatory documents and records exist, and then what are some commonly used but non-mandatory documents. But a couple of mandatory documents certainly include, you got to document your scope. You've got to document your OHSAS policy. You've got to document responsibilities and authorities. You have to document your process for addressing risks and opportunities. You have to have a methodology and criteria for the assessment of your risks. So those are a couple of examples. I hope that answers this question.
Perfect. Thank you, Greg. There's another question from Rahul. What is other in legal and other requirements?
Okay, so the other in legal and other requirements would be things that are not required by law for your organization to comply to, but which your organization may choose to comply to because it feels that it's important as part of its rollout and management of safety. So maybe, for example, there's a consensus standard that is not obligatory for you, but which you want your organization to, or the organization determines it will follow. So if it determines it's going to follow that particular consensus standard, then it needs to identify that as such. It needs to include it in its list of legal and other. And that then becomes one of those other requirements. Okay.
Thank you, Greg. Please send in any more questions. I'm taking this question that I have last. If there are any more last-minute questions, please send it before we end the webinar. Greg, the question is, if you're a small organization, do you still need to have written procedures?
Okay, so under the 45,001 standard, there are certain things that you need to have documented and other things that you don't. So I think the question could be interpreted somewhat broadly, and it would really depend upon what it is that you're doing within your organization. For example, yes, you would have a procedure for how you will go about evaluating your health and safety risks. You need to have that methodology documented. You need to have a procedure for emergency preparedness and response. On the other hand, there are other things that are not mandatory documents, but for which you might choose still to have because it helps you best manage that particular process. So non-mandatory documents that some organizations could choose to have could be procedure for hazard identification and assessment, procedures for communication, procedure for change management. So perhaps it would be best to discuss the specific application and situation, and I think that a smaller organization is going to have oftentimes different needs than a larger organization for different reasons in terms of span of control or inherent risks and so on. But the 45,001 standard will call out when you need a document, but apart from that, it needs to be a decision made by your organization, depending upon whether or not you think that procedure is essential to control the risk that you're trying to control. And I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Greg. There are a few more questions, but I think that's all. We'll take that as a last question. We can, if you need Greg to answer any specific questions, you can get in touch with Greg and Abby directly. If you're interested in tackling the legal compliance and auditing aspects of ISO 45001 or 14001 standard, we at Mnemonic are more than happy to help. Once again, our email is info@mnemonic.com and our website is mnemonic.com. We are friendly and we respond quickly, so don't hesitate to reach out. So that's all for today. Thank you so much, Greg, for your time. And I hope the attendees have enjoyed.
It was a pleasure to participate, and thank you.
I hope everyone enjoyed the webinar and found it informative. As soon as you log out, you would see a post-webinar survey. We would appreciate your feedback on today's webinar. It just helps us improve future webinars. So please take a moment to answer the few questions in the survey. And that's all for today. Take care, and we'll see you soon.